Ordinary Brits, on salaries as low as £20,000, face being slapped with a £170,000 inheritance tax bill in just 2 years' time. Rachel Reeves announced back in the budget pensions would now be classed as part of your estate when you die, meaning the average earner who has saved a healthy pot would be liable for the 40% tax rate. The inheritance tax threshold stands at £325,000, but has been frozen since 2009. The average house price in the UK is £268,000, still well shy of the threshold. But from 2027, if you die and leave behind pension benefits, these will be taxable as part of your estate. Now, the average man's pension pot by the time he reaches his 60s adds up to £228,000, so this, together with his house, would take him well past the threshold, and his kids would be liable for the 40% tax. But new analysis shows someone in their mid-40s now, on a salary as low as £20,000, could be liable for a tax bill of £170,000 based on what they'd expect to have in their pension at age 68. Now, an average earner on 35 grand could owe £194,000. Someone earning a bit more on 55,000 would owe £219,000, and someone earning a bit more on £80,000 could be asked for £268,000. The Treasury thinks 31,200 extra estates a year could be dragged into inheritance tax as a result. Finance expert Justin Urquhart Stewart said this is a tax on working people, despite the government's promises before the election.
For an awful lot of people at the moment, they don't understand what's happening, or they are probably getting a hint that they're not going to have enough money to retire on, and they're going to have to carry on working. It's fascinating when you hear politicians saying we're not taxing working people. Well, of course, that's exactly what has been doing. You only have to look over the past few months where we had national insurance being increased as far as the employer is concerned. Well, actually, is that a tax which is actually going to help any particular? No, it's a tax on jobs. And so, the government can really have a significant impact on that by trying to make sure that tax is then more efficient and encouraging people to invest in the right way, maybe in the UK, in particular areas of infrastructure and things like that. So, for example, if you wanted infrastructure, say, for power stations and things, there's no reason why the government could actually open up a bond for that and actually say that bond could be free of all tax, including inheritance tax. So you just design things which are outside it. But the trouble is, again, the Treasury doesn't really know these things, and certainly the politicians haven't got a clue.
The government reckons that due to these measures, 121,000 extra estates a year will face higher inheritance tax bills, despite Brits being largely against the levy. As it stands, 5% of estates fall under the tax, but in the next 4 years, Rachel Reeves wants to double that number to 10%. Which is unprecedented for a tax that was intended to hit only the wealthy. Justin said people will need to start looking at their financial planning as young as possible, as relying on an inheritance or estate pension looks increasingly unwise.
We're at a time when we're trying to encourage people to save to look after themselves, not fall back on the government. And the government's very keen, whatever your political colour, is to actually pushing more responsibility back to the individuals. But of course, that can be very dangerous, as we've seen with the issues related to national insurance and obviously with inheritance tax issues. People don't understand what's happening. They end up doing nothing and ending up with a family sitting there with a stocking rate tax bill. So what does the individual have to do? The answer is, I'm afraid, have to go back and do some calculations as young as possible. I would encourage people to start out a pension when you are 0. Obviously, the baby doesn't understand it's got a pension, but at that stage, the godparents can all put money into that pension. And if you were getting, say, a return on that between 5 and 7% a year after costs, that means your money is going to be doubling probably every 10 years. It doesn't sound wildly exciting. But if you've got 10,000 over a lifetime, so you start off with 10, so you the next one, so it's 20, 40, 80, and you just 160, 320, and suddenly over a period of say 4 or 5 decades, you've now got a princely sum of money. It sounds a lot, but of course, actually, when you break it down in terms of income that's giving you to have in your old age, it's not a huge amount. But put it this way, you could actually do that, the government can't afford to do that. And what they've got is, at the moment, they're stuck where they have an obligation to pay pensions which they can't afford. And so how do you answer that one? The answer is borrow more, which will cost more. And so I'm afraid we're in a bit of a doom loop here until someone cuts through it cuts through the Gordian knot and say, right, this is how you are now going to run your family finances. Here are try and simplify the tax rules over inheritance tax and over pensions to make sure it's encouraging people to take more responsibility. This, however, goes back to one of the key issues. No one's told you what to do, no one's educated you, it's not on the school syllabus. It does appear sometimes in the school syllabus, but not, it's all a bit fluffy about culture and things like that. Whereas actually what you want to do if you're doing your maths GCSE, what you want to know is, I've got X amount of money to pay off my mortgage or pension this year, how do I do it? So you leave school with a better understanding of your finances than your parents have. That's what you need to do.
But then make this argument for people to put money aside from earlier.
Yeah.
Isn't it a bit of a perverse incentive structure to ask people to save but then tax rate it?
Yeah, it is utterly perverse. It is, and frankly, no, not just unfair, it's frankly stupid. And so what you want to be able to do is design so that inheritance tax was always regarded as the tax you could avoid. Why? Because you could hold things over 7 years, and also by transferring those assets to other people. And as you previously mentioned, maybe overseas as well. So it's not necessarily in the UK. But because the consumer's sitting there blind at the moment, it can't actually see what's hitting them and when it's going to be hitting them, and the answer will be in the time when you're least able to manage it because you've retired and you're not earning much income, if at all.
The UK economy has the lowest level of investment in the G7. It has struggled with productivity, meaning the amount we produce per hour worked is actually 20% lower than in the United States. What's often missing in the conversation around this is that our competitors don't levy inheritance tax in the same way, which means families can invest in businesses and property through the generations to pass on to their children. In the US, there is no federal IHT. The UK and Denmark are the only countries to tax the estate of the person who's died. Most countries who do have some form of the tax exempt the main home and business, and France and Germany exempt children from any tax, which might be a reason why the UK sells off its businesses rather than passing them down to grow them through the generations. Justin said this must change to help the UK grow.
This will have a direct impact on the value of the UK economy, the wealth of individuals. What you want to do is encourage people for long-term investment. Let's go to Germany. There you can see the tax regimes encourage people to invest in what are known as the Mittelstand companies, sort of mid-range, quite often family companies, and they're able to pass it on generation to generation because it's tax efficient to do so. Whereas in the UK, probably the best thing you can do is you get to a certain stage, you just sell out altogether and leave it for the next person. Whereas actually you need to be able to develop and grow those businesses. The good news is we set up more businesses in this country than France or Germany, and what happens though, unfortunately, is they get to a certain scale, and if they're in technology businesses, the Americans come and buy them and take them elsewhere because the capital isn't being directed towards that investment. Where would that capital come from? The answer is, well, from people's pension pots. And so therefore you've got that money being used for something creative, so it has a knock-on effect. And so actually the government will get more income from successful companies, which will pay corporation tax, employing people, therefore they have income tax, and so they'll earn more money out of that than taxing the dead estates, which is just totally negative. And so this is, you're quite right to say, this is illogical. You want to encourage longer term investing and directing it to where those areas are. You could see this extending to even say things, dare one say, the NHS. Again, the NHS is almost a bottomless pit as the amount of money you want to spend on it. But what you can do is transfer more responsibility for families to maybe look after their aging grandparents, great-grandparents, and the state can't afford to do it. And you can hear the politicians talking now about how are we going to manage this. With an aging population, you have to go to... In an aging population, you're going to have to find a way of getting those individuals to understand what they've got now and have a target for it.
There is a much smarter way of taxing, he said, calling our current approach of relying on the dead dumb.
The tax and saving regime needs to be thought about in one area, not divided up into different bits. So you encourage people to save, but don't then put a disincentive on it by hammering people with inheritance tax, because that is merely cutting off the money which could be used elsewhere. What you want is a positive form of taxation where it encourages people to invest in the UK in certain types of companies. And how do you do that? Not by the government paying you, but by having tax incentives. A perfect example is something known as the Enterprise Investment Scheme. And the government could actually expand that significantly now. What it is effectively is giving a guarantee to investors that actually maybe it's 50% of their capital, or maybe more or less, doesn't really matter, is protected, and the government, if the business goes bust, then you can get that amount of money back. But it doesn't cost the government anything until those companies go bust, and most of them won't go bust. And what it does do is actually build up the businesses, they make profits, they employ more people, there's corporation tax, there's income tax, and therefore we've also got more people spending money, so there's VAT money coming in as well. And what's it cost the government so far? Nothing. Inheritance tax is a negative. That's nothing creative on that at all, that's just taxing the dead. Actually make tax positive and creative and encourage the economy to grow. So it means logically trying to put together the taxation system and the saving and investment system so they actually fit together and don't work against one another, which is what we're seeing at the moment with inheritance.
So could a tax like inheritance tax be the reason why British business owners just sell their companies off?
I've come across quite a few examples over the years where people have just thought, how do I pass this on to the next generation or not? And one of the key issues will be what am I passing on? And if it's a successful business, it's going to be something which will be hitting that inheritance tax. So it's actually then putting people off doing the transfer to the next generation, and it's not encouraging growth. What you want to be able to do if you really want to have a creative tax system is actually encouraging people to invest and also protecting some of those returns afterwards as well, so they can move across the family to the next generation. That's constructive. Dumb taxation is where we're just taking money out of people's pockets, and of course by doing that, that will directly impact on our economy, because remember, over 65% of our economy is based on the consumer, you and I, going out to have supper or something like that, or just spending money. You want people to spending money because then they could have a VAT coming in there as well. So one of the measures of the economy is its productivity and the speed of money going through an economy. The greater the speed going through, every time it's you're buying and selling something, there's a bit more tax coming through. So the government earns more money out of success, not out of death.
But for those who want to get ahead of these tax changes, Justin recommends lots of planning and mitigation.
What they can do straight away is actually look up in terms of annuity tables, which is basically annuities where you put a sum of money with an insurance company and they will guarantee to give you an income for the rest of your life or whatever period you want. But that gives you an idea of what they think the returns they can get over that period of time. So as an individual, you can actually find this information out to actually say over 20, 30 years, I need a return of 5%, 6%. I don't need high levels. You're just compounding it slowly over time, so it's relatively low risk. They could do that now, just with almost on the back of a fag packet. Well, none of us smoke anymore, but what would have been a fag packet, to work out actually what they need to try and do. Then think also about on the family side as well, because again, if you've got your own business, the sooner you transfer part of that value to the next generation, and so we make sure you take advantage of the 7-year ownership issue, and so you're moving more of those assets out of potentially taxation liability coming through, but also it's being used creatively. As I say, you want a taxation which is encouraging people to do things, not just to drop down debt.
I'm Nick Dunning for GB News.